privilege to be with you. I'd like to begin this presentation with a poem. So let's put ourselves in the presence of God, just briefly for a second. You see, I want a lot. Maybe I want it all. The darkness of each endless fall, the shimmering light of each ascent. So many are alive who don't seem to care. Casual, easy, they move in the world as though untouched. But you take pleasure in the faces of those who know they thirst. You cherish those who grip you for survival. You are not dead yet. It's not too late to open your depths by plunging into them and drink in the life that reveals itself quietly there. That's a poem by Rilke, and it establishes what I hope to be a mood, a climate about this notion of remembering God and the relationship that that has with prayer, more particularly unceasing prayer. A potentially scary word, but one that I'm convinced is absolutely vital to our own peace and happiness. Now, historically, remembering God is a central biblical injunction. It's present throughout the Hebrew Scriptures as well as the New Testament. And it's why it's been central in monastic spirituality, both East and West. From one biblical text to the other, there's the constant theme, do not forget the Lord your God. To give you just a couple of examples from Deuteronomy. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with great and goodly cities, which you did not build, and houses full of all good things, which you did not fill, and cisterns hewn out, which you did not hew. And when you eat and are full, and take heed lest you forget the Lord your God, lest you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Lest you forget the Lord your God. And then, similarly in the Gospel of St. Matthew, where Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So go, therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teach them that I am always with you, yes, till the end of time. Now, it's important for us to understand what's being said here. What does it mean to forget God? What are we speaking of here? Do we forget God as if we were forgetting a chore or a birthday? I don't think that's it at all. Forgetting God means neglecting the deepest values we have to live by. We forget God not as a concept, but as a living context, the living presence at the heart of our spiritual quest. And the paradox here is that in forgetting God, we actually forget our true selves. What's insidious about this notion of forgetfulness is that it's not overtly sinful. We can appear to be doing absolutely nothing wrong, and yet the state of our consciousness, it's a million miles from God. Now, as a contrast to this, tradition has put forth two scriptural texts that relate remembering and prayer, and which have been central to monastics throughout the centuries. The first text is from Luke, chapter 18, where Jesus tells a parable about, quote, the necessity to pray always without losing heart. And then Paul's admonition in 1 Corinthians 5 to pray without ceasing. What do we mean there? What does it mean? What would it mean to pray without ceasing? Again, I think it has less to do with thinking of God as a mental concept that's continuously in the head, though sometimes, to be fair, this is how it's been understood throughout the tradition. Sometimes, when it's taken to its extreme, that understanding can be literalistic and suffocating. Now, in my judgment, a better understanding is that it means living in harmony with God's way, with God's plan. And were this to happen, the cumulative effect of that would be profoundly transforming to our lives. The idea here is, to the extent that we learn how to live perpetually awake to God's presence, the greater chance we'll have to live a better, fuller life, one where we're acting freely, more in accord with who we are. Now, I'll just say something just as a counterpoint to that. In this whole idea, the possibility for falling into spiritual self-deception as a result of misunderstanding this topic is quite real. And so that's part of the thing that I would like to address in this presentation. Now first, there's this word. It's a Greek word called metanoia. It's a Greek word used in the New Testament. It means changing our minds. It's the first word in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus uttered. Metanite is what he says. Change your mind. First thing that Jesus says. And hence, it's intimately connected with what Jesus is trying to create in each of us. A changed mindset. Now, as a gospel issue, what it really means is moving away from the self to a new way of looking at reality. An authentic remembrance of God, that's exactly what it is. It's passing from an ego-centered life to one where we're looking at ourselves through God's eyes, where our attention is continually being drawn out of ourselves towards the one in whom we live, move, and have our being. Now, this is a movement of grace and virtue. And the paradox here is God can only be known by engaging with the world. Far from separating us from the world, loving God puts us in actual deeper touch with other human beings and with creation because we love them in God as God has created them. Now, within Orthodoxy, one of the ways that we come to love in this manner is by remembering God through the practice of the prayer of Jesus. And there's, for sure, an entire spirituality known as hesychasm that has developed as a discipline to lead to this sort of love. The word hesychasm, do you know that word? Does everyone know what that? Hesychasm, it's basically from the Greek, means quiet and stillness. And so hesychasm is a spirituality about that sort of quiet and stillness. And the idea behind it is that the more our hearts are still and quiet, the more we can see reality as it truly is, and then respond accordingly. Now, in the strict sense, hesychasm implied the continuous repetition of the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, we'll be talking about this a little bit later in the presentation, and what a healthy use of this prayer might look like. But I'd also like to say that such a devotion, such a repetitive type of devotion, is not unique to Orthodox Christianity, or more broadly to the Christian tradition. And while the repetition of prayer has its counterpart in Western spirituality, for example, with the saying of the Rosary, it's also central to the spiritual practice of many other faith traditions, such as in Buddhism, where monks have been using prayer beads for millennia, long before Christian monks used them. And similarly, in Hinduism as well, where Brahmins and ascetics, they've used them for even longer. And more recently, in Islam, where Sufis, for example, they also use prayer beads. In each of these traditions, there's the common desire to bring the heart to stillness through the conscious repetition of a prayer. It taps into something truly fundamental to what it means to be human, that all human beings can experience if they truly go deep into themselves. Now, significantly, each tradition has found that such a practice can center the heart to see reality as it truly is. And yet, for most, such a suggestion seems a little bit like a pipe dream. Now, given the normal busyness of our lives, from the early morning commute, for example, to navigating city crowds, to the turbulence of many of our places of business, to the infinite variety of ways each of us has to make a living, once we get into the daily grind, it feels like it's all we can do to keep our heads above water. It doesn't feel spiritual. And people certainly don't usually describe their experience of daily life as prayerful or recollected. In fact, instead of remembering God in their daily lives, they confess more to a general forgetfulness of God, taken up as they are with the demands of their life. So this is something that I get an awful lot. People coming to the monastery and saying, remembering God, praying always, well, that's fine for you monks. I live in the real world. I mean, how realistic is such a goal given the responsibilities that I have? Now, it's interesting that while traditionally in Christianity, monasteries have been places in which people have looked to find guidance towards that place of silence, today, a lot of people are suspicious of monasteries, and particularly here in America, where there's really not been an established tradition of monastic life. And so many wonder what possible relevance monasteries may have to ordinary men and women, seeing as how they're so far, set so far apart from the world of the everyday. They wonder, does the search for inner silence mean that basically I have to live like a monk or a nun? That I have to sever my relationship with the world, with my life? And as I said, even with a monastery like New Skete, where I'm from, which, because of our own history and circumstances, is not so removed from the world as a place like, Simonopetra on Mount Athos, we encounter the exact same mindset. We receive many, many thousands of visitors a year. And yet people still tend to idealize our life. And they can't imagine how monastic wisdom could be of relevance to their daily struggles. Monastic life, to them, just seems too different, too foreign. Well, I beg to differ. Because truth be told, the silence that I'm speaking of is not simply a given in monastic life. And what monk or nun doesn't discover very quickly that the monastery is just as much a part of the world as secular society? Now, just random examples from my own life. The dogs that continue to bark. Can you find true silence when dogs are barking in the early morning? That's my monastery. Or when a brother, for example, erupts in anger suddenly. What does silence and prayer and remembrance of God look like then? Or the demands of the mail order season, when if you go to the sister's bakery during that season, you would laugh. It's better than a Groucho Marx movie. All sorts of stress. Busyness. Our sisters are working to support themselves, but it's an incredibly busy, very active time. Or Sister Katrina here, our youngest nun, who tragically died from pancreatic cancer. She was a gifted woman, a doctor in archaeology, became a nun. She was a person of great promise, comes down with pancreatic cancer suddenly and is dead within 9 months. Can you imagine what that does to the community, to the temperature of the community? And her death was an exemplary good death. So all of these types of examples that I think monks from any monastery would probably be able to say, amen, I know exactly what that is, should reassure you who may not be monastics that I'm not speaking out of an idealistic part of my head. We experience many of the same stresses that you do. No life is immune from this. The question that all of us face is, how is it possible to find that inner silence? How is it possible to live with a remembrance of God as an anchor to my life? And really, does monastic wisdom have something positive and constructive and enlightening to say to answer to that question? Now, one point that I would say, and I'd have you think about it, that's for sure. Jesus' life certainly suggests that we can live spiritually in the busiest, most chaotic of circumstances with a spirit of prayer and inner stillness. Why? Jesus was the contemplative par excellence. Yet he lived in a world of activity, noise, where the chaotic and unpredictable happened all the time. When we read the Gospels and meditate on them, Jesus' life was very similar to our life. And it's not just simply because he was the God-man that he was able to do that. He was pointing in an exemplary way that spiritual life doesn't get in the way with ordinary life. So based on Jesus' example, being mindful of God and increasingly prayerful is possible in whatever circumstance we happen to be in. And our whole tradition of prayer and spirituality is in accord with that. It says the exact same thing. Now, if you think I'm pulling your leg, like, oh yeah, sort of winking, recall the story of St. Anthony the Great. He was a famous desert father. and how it was revealed to Abba Anthony in his desert that there was one who was his equal in the city. He was a doctor by profession. And what it says in that tale is, whatever he had beyond his needs, he gave to the poor. And every day he sang the Sanctus with the angels. It's a beautiful tale. But I'd wager also that there were many, many others as well. For example, the housewife raising her children, the carpenter using his gifts with his hands and blessing God throughout the day, the farmer working the land, and on and on and on. Now, let me make something perfectly clear. I'm not one at all to belittle the monastery. I love monastic life. And I love my life as a monk. But I don't believe it is any more possible to live a spiritual life in the monastery than it is in the world. God can be sought and found anywhere. God can be remembered in the busiest of circumstances. And that life in the monastery is just as exposed to chaos and busyness as in life in the world. But how, pray tell? Now that's the million-dollar question. And that's what we get to spend the rest of our lives working out. Now, fortunately, we're not flying blind. If we're speaking about unceasing prayer, we're really talking about remembering God throughout the rhythms of our daily life and understanding that the way this will express itself will vary according to what we happened to be doing. Now, there's a very suggestive passage from Abba Isaiah the Solitary, an old desert father who said, "Stand guard, then, over your heart. Keep a watch on your senses. And if the remembrance of God dwells peaceably within you, you will catch the thieves when they try to deprive you of it. And when a person has an exact knowledge about the nature of his thoughts, he recognizes those that are about to enter and disturb him, troubling our intellect with distractions and making it lazy. Those who recognize these thoughts for what they are remain undisturbed and continue in prayer to God." This is meant to happen, whatever we happen to be doing. Now, for that reason, while I love the Jesus prayer, and I understand that it can help us be conscious of our thoughts, reminding us of being in God's presence at all times. In the novel, Franny Glass, she's a brilliant student who becomes enamored of the Jesus prayer, but she has no direction. And so she tries to emulate the example of the Russian pilgrim literally. And Franny drives herself to madness, trying literally to follow his example by disconnecting from reality. And this story is a very sobering tale of imbalance and fanaticism, and of increasing isolationism and alienation. Sadly, it misses the whole intent of the prayer. Unceasing prayer, even when used with the Jesus prayer as the anchor for this, it's not like music. It's not background noise that's nondescript and which goes on automatically, regardless of whatever we happen to be doing. Prayer needs to be much more intentional than that. As a movement of the heart, and sometimes it will be accompanied with words, other times it will be simply a silent elan, a pulse of love. Now, if you were to ask me, how did this become real for me? How did this idea sort of become important for me, I'd like to share two stories from my own life that let the broader tradition of our community sort of become a little bit familiar to you. They both occurred when I was a young monk. And as I've indicated, in our tradition, the spiritual ideal of unceasing prayer, it's the goal of every monastic. And so, when I was a young monk, I was deeply moved by The Way of the Pilgrim. And after I read that book, I was determined I was going to follow the Pilgrim's example. I was going to repeat the Jesus prayers ceaselessly throughout the day, whatever I happened to be doing. Now, as most of you perhaps know, our community is involved in breeding dogs and training dogs. Okay, that's one of the ways that we support ourselves. So one day, shortly after this, I was working down in the boarding kennel, where we have all sorts of dogs in for training, other people's dogs. And there happened to be a very, very aggressive German Shepherd. Now, I was cleaning out the kennels. I was busily and dutifully and devotedly saying my prayer as I was cleaning the kennels. I was so taken up with it that I really wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. And so when I closed the gates, I neglected to lock one gate, the gate of that aggressive German Shepherd. And so when I let the dogs in and I was walking away, the shepherd flipped the latch, bounded out into the kennel, and bit me right in the ass. Forgive me. I was enlightened. That was a touch from God. God was saying, what were you paying attention to? Where were you finding me? You were so busy saying your prayer that you were missing me right in front of your eyes. So that was my little wake-up call. Now, the second experience happened after I'd been asked to assume the responsibility for the training program. Now, when I was at first assigned to the work, I really didn't know anything about training. And so I obediently began trying to learn everything I could about training dogs. Okay? I was so busy with the technical aspect of it that I couldn't think of the spiritual dimension that was present in working with dogs. I was too scared that people would come to pick their dogs up and they wouldn't be trained. So I was really swept up in this. And I really didn't, in my work with dogs, realize that something profound was missing. It was becoming sort of mechanical. I was, after a while I discovered I was good at it and I was able to, people seemed to be pleased by the work that I was doing, but it became very repetitive and very mechanical, okay? And I was sort of bored with it. Well, one day I was having to take a dog through a practice session. She was going to be going home the next day. So I went out for a trial run with her just to rehearse the thing. And as I began working with that dog, suddenly everything changed. It was as if the two of us were doing ballet, being totally in sync with each other. Our attention was totally focused on each other, and that moment was something timeless. There was a sense of unity and oneness, and it literally took my breath away. And for the precious minutes that I experienced in that working with that dog, I experienced a harmony, a oneness that was as prayerful as any moment that I had spent in church. And the little light went on the aha moment, and it changed me forever, helping me see that the whole of life is meant to be a piece, a sacred dance, if you will, and that it's all linked together, and we get to continually move through that unfolding. Think of that. That's a beautiful and encouraging and hopeful view of what life can be. Life doesn't have to get in the way of our prayer, of our remembering God, of our spirituality. And from this, we can ask, then, honestly, what's the compass direction of our lives? Are we heading towards a more continuing remembrance of God as the basic orientation of our thoughts and actions? What we're speaking of here, I believe, is prayer and remembrance of God more as a climate. One that we want to not only create, but continuously deepen. And there's no ceiling, no limit. We can actually be persistent in creating a culture of remembrance in which all of the elements of life remind us of God's presence and God's glory. That can be symbolic, it can be sacramental, and it can be deeply incarnational as we observe the goodness of the world and of creation. All of it reveals God's splendor and glory. Now, however, in saying this, there's no doubt that the invocation of the name of Jesus on every situation and person we encounter can be a powerful reminder of God's presence in this now, right here. And I would suggest simplicity is the key here. It's the desire for single-mindedness, for keeping our thoughts and experiences rooted in the presence of God. It helps deepen the consciousness that life is not a series of isolated fragments, but life is like a mosaic, and it all fits together. And so here, at the beginning of this talk, I can say Jesus, and it sets a climate. It becomes a fragrance like incense in our inner life. Rather than Jesus, 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 Jesus. That's not what unceasing prayer is meant to be, in my humble opinion. Every piece of life needs to fit into the whole. And I think that this is what living contemplatively is all about, bringing everything into oneness. It reveals the sacred character of life. Now, the word contemplation, it's a word that a lot of people sort of have heard but not necessarily know about. It harkens back, that word, to the Roman augurs long, long ago, who measured the celestial templum in order to represent it here on earth with their huge temples and monuments. The sense amongst the Romans was to establish our life according to the divine model. Okay? Con templum, the drawing together of the two temples, the temple in heaven, the temple on earth. And to me, it's exactly what Jesus was praying in the Our Father, on earth as it is in heaven, and which he manifested in his life. Now, the one who truly lives as a contemplative pierces through every situation prayerfully with the pointed fire of love. It's what St. Augustine spoke of famously in his letter to Proba, where he suggested quick, fervent prayers that are hurled like swift javelins to pierce the heavens. That's the inner prayer. That's the cry that pierces. But how do we practice this? Just as there's a trap in trying to say prayers all the time, there's equally a fallacy of thinking, my whole life is a prayer. I don't need to set aside specific times and ways to pray. I don't have time for that. That's delusional. Practice is crucial in the spiritual life. And each of us needs a realistic personal rule, a way of prayer, if you will, that helps us become more conscious and focused, more loving and free. But what serves creating the climate, that's what can become integral to our practice. And I'd just like to offer a couple of suggestions. In addition to just a quiet period of prayerfulness, using, for example, the Jesus prayer as sort of like I said, a base, a foundation. Psalmody is another way to increase one's prayerfulness. It can easily be used to bookend each day. The Psalms are the prayer book of the church, and they're helpful because they're absolutely real. They cover the vast scope of human emotions and locate prayer in the midst of those emotions. All of the emotions. Joy, thanksgiving, but also mourning, grief, anger. The Psalms teach us how to find prayer in each of those situations. And as a result, they connect with our deepest feelings, helping us to own them, to gain control over them without repressing them. Another important thing is prayerful journaling. The discipline of keeping a spiritual diary that's for your own eyes only. Okay, but it allows you the opportunity to simply put down in 10 minutes things deeply that you're thinking about, that you can continually come back to, which refresh your memory, help you be reminded of how God has been acting in your life. I'd like to just briefly tell you a story about a monk I knew named Father Robert. He was, when I knew him, an old monk. He had lived in the monastery for over 60 years, and he would help out in different jobs during the day. He worked in the laundry. And one day when I was working in the laundry with him, I had only been there at the monastery a short time, in walks Brother Robert. He sort of shifted. He was 85 years old at the time. But all of a sudden, he goes to where he's going to be folding napkins. And he does this. And then he starts folding the napkins. And I thought, oh, how quaint. How quaint that is. How pious. But then I would see him around the monastery at different activities. And before each activity, what he'd do is make the sign of the cross. What he was doing was he was stringing his life together with the sign of the cross. He was establishing each activity so simply, so unselfconsciously, with the sign of the cross. Now I ask you a question. If I make the sign of the cross and then clean my bedroom, is that prayer? Can it be prayer? It doesn't have to be prayer, but it can put me in the consciousness of the presence of God and allow me to do my work conscientiously, recolectively, in a way that acknowledges God in that moment. Every activity. Why do we make the sign of the cross and pray before meals? Why do we do that? It's because the meal becomes a sacred event, an event suffused with prayer. And that happens to feel pretty good, like the festival down below. Really good food. That's why we not only blessed the food, we permeated the meal with prayerfulness. And God was remembered in that moment. So what does prayer look like? What does prayer look like in our lives? What can it look like? For example, two friends talking with each other. Could we ever say that such an encounter could not be as prayerful as it is delightful? That we literally remember the incredible mystery of God present in our midst in that encounter with the dear friend? Or for example, another example, when an individual becomes so immersed in a research project that they block out all of the extraneous noise, they become one with the work, with the problem, with the joy of discovering something new, and they see the wonder and mystery of God in their very effort in a new way. You ever hear scientists talk about their experience of the divine, of the sacred, in that moment of deep work, attention, and discovery? I've known several scientists who've come to believe in God because of that experience. Surely that can be an element of prayerfulness. Or what about engaging in physical exercise? We can have the experience of exercising prayerfully, using the exercise as a physical discipline that expresses our gratitude and respect to God for our health. Prayer doesn't need to be excluded from that. Our very doing, our very jogging can be prayer. Or the paradox of the musician who's playing his or her chosen instrument and is so taken up with focus and concentration that they experience a deep stillness at the heart of their music making. We recently had a concert at New Skete in which this particular pianist named Haskell Small, he performed a piece called Journeys in Silence by a composer called Monastic. And the performance, I have to tell you what it was like. It had this effect for both performer and audience. The music that he created took us to a place of silence and stillness in which thoughts gave way to simple, silent abiding. And God was remembered wordlessly. I think many of us have known the experience of reading a book. Have you had the experience of becoming so taken into the book that you lose sense of time? What's going on there? Can that experience be part of our prayer? I believe it can. Now, what I think we can see in all of this is that, I hope, prayer can express itself in every specific situation in life in a way that's entirely appropriate for that specific context. And indeed, prayer is going to look different in every situation. But we can begin each activity, each task, by remembering God. Lord Jesus, mercy. And making the intention to give our very best in that moment. And I tell you, when we do this, we honor both God and our own dignity as free human beings. We don't squander the time that's been given to us. Now I'd like to end this presentation with a passage from the late Orthodox theologian Paul Evdokimov, which is one of the most profound observations on prayer that I've ever come across. This is what he said. Quote, "In the catacombs, the most frequent image is the figure of a woman in prayer, the orans. She represents the one true attitude of the human soul. It's not enough to say prayers. One must be prayer, prayer incarnate. It is not enough to have moments of praise. All of life, each act, every gesture, even the smile of the human face must become a hymn of adoration, an offering, a prayer. One should not offer what one has, but what one is. That's the lesson of our tradition. That's the gift that has been given to us. And to the extent that we're inwardly conscious and free, no external condition, no matter how noisy or distracting, makes the inner prayer of the heart impossible. The intention of the heart determines the prayerfulness. That little javelin, that elan, that moment, that elan to God, that determines the prayer. And when that happens, a fragrance of prayer interweaves with the unfolding of daily life. Thank you very much.